Good morning everyone. Bore da I gyd. Greetings from Wales. My name is Jayne Davidson and I'm Pro Vice-Chancellor for Sustainability and Engagement at the University of Wales Trinity St David. Behind me you'll see the banner for the institute I set up in 2012, INSPIRE, the Institute for Sustainable Practice, Innovation and Resource Effectiveness. And what we do through that in our university, a regional university in the south and west of Wales, is to try and ensure that students develop the creative thinking skills, the creative problem-solving skills that they need in terms of facing the challenges of the future. And this to me is a fundamentally important objective. And this grows out of both my personal life, my professional life, and also very importantly in the context of the policy discussion that we're going to have today, out of the fact that the Welsh Government has made a real commitment in the context of sustainable development. So as you can see, my session this morning is called Permission to Think Differently. Now things don't start as an adult. It's really important, if we're going to talk about education for sustainable development and global citizenship, that this is woven into an education curriculum from the earliest points in life. I had a very privileged childhood. I grew up in America, in Africa, and in the UK. And what I remember most from my childhood in Africa, where I spent some 10 years from the age of 5 to the age of 15, so had a lot of my schooling there, was that nobody wasted anything. All resources were used effectively. People were very careful about the use of water. People were very careful to make sure that crops could grow effectively. And since I grew up in Zimbabwe, which was then the breadbasket of Africa, I could see very clearly both the consequences of good land management then and much poorer land management and the consequences of climate change in the future. Now, as humans, we rely absolutely on food for the source for our own future. So not having the appropriate relationship between the actions we take as humans and the planet, the single planet we have at our disposal, will have critical consequences. And we hear each day of our lives the impact of climate change, the lack of food security in countries. In Britain, for example, we cannot feed ourselves if we had to tomorrow. So how did we get into a situation where the things that are most fundamentally important for our survival we don't consider effectively, either through our education system or in government priorities? So I think that old slogan from the 1970s, think global, act local, and the work of E.F. Schumacher and others has been hugely influential in my life, as well as growing up in countries that have far less of the consumerist agenda that we have here and have used their natural resources far better. So I think it's important in the context of this discussion that you see that my own childhood, my own education, my own circumstances influenced my thinking here today. And it's really important, if we take the old Ignatius Loyola principle, give me the child of 7 and I'll give you the man, that we educate our children from the earliest point in their years in terms of understanding the challenges of the world around them, but also understanding the importance of how to protect it. Now, Wales has an interesting story. I've said permission to think differently on my title slide, 2000 to 2017, so I can capture the outcomes of the decade for sustainable development and the UN reports. But I think that there was a particular story that started in Wales with the new devolved assembly in 1999, which in fact gave Wales a new beginning on this agenda, because those people who set up the arrangements for the new devolved assembly, which were enshrined in the Government of Wales Act of 1998 and subsequently in 2006, laid into that act that the government has a duty to have a scheme setting out how it will promote sustainable development in the exercise of its functions. Now, that was a really interesting proposition. Other countries in the UK didn't have that. And those people who put that in place in the initial commission that made recommendations to the Welsh office of the day surely thought that that initiative in legislation would lead to a different kind of behaviour in a new devolved nation. Very soon after coming in, the National Assembly executive, of which I was proud to be a part from 2000 as a Minister for Education, used the Brundtland definition of sustainable development to guide their thinking. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Very important in the context of what has happened in Wales subsequently, that Brundtland definition that was agreed in the early part of the year 2000 as the marker, the definition for how Wales would interpret sustainable development is still at the heart of what is now legislation. Following the commitment to deliver sustainable development or to promote sustainable development in everything that the government in Wales did, there was an enormous set of opportunities that were taken forward, not least between 2002 and 2008. And as you will see on the slide that demonstrates the themes in Wales from 2002 to 8, the themes that were to be explored throughout the whole of the education system were links between society, economy, environment, and between our lives and those of people throughout the world. That very strong link with global citizenship that is not always there when people consider education for sustainable development. The needs and rights of both present and future generations, relating straight back to the Brundtland definition. The relationship between power, resources, and human rights. A huge tension in countries throughout the world, not least in terms of our country at the moment. And by our country, I mean all 4 nations. And the actions that individuals and organisations can take in responding to those local and global issues, but being mindful of all those themes together. So this isn't an individual agenda about what action can you take in response to local and global issues. It's about thinking about the local and global implications of what we do, acknowledging and balancing the relationship between power, resources and rights, looking at the needs and rights of current and future generations and getting those links between our lives and other people's lives into balance. So from the perspective of education for sustainable development and global citizenship, I was privileged to be the Minister in Wales from 2000 to 2007 with the responsibility for education, skills and lifelong learning. And it was really important to me that it was education, skills and lifelong learning. It wasn't just around a school agenda or a nursery agenda. It was also about ensuring that the principles of education for sustainable development and global citizenship were taken right through the education system. So as you see on this slide, the ESDGC journey in Wales from 2000 to 2008, the first publication produced by our then curriculum body was called ESDGC Why, What, How. And that was a seminal publication. There was nothing like it elsewhere in the UK. It had examples of good practice. Teachers loved it. They had their own practice celebrated in it, but also they could learn from what others were doing. And I felt that it was really important that we enshrined ESDGC properly in the curriculum. So from 2004, we put it into the Common Inspection Framework, and schools were required in their inspection regimes to comment on ESDGC. In 2006, we made sure that this Common Inspection Framework and the requirement was extended to all sectors. So ESDGC, a strategy for action, required the work-based learning sector, the adult and community learning sector, further education, higher education, to have champions and common understanding of the agenda. And then when I left the education portfolio, to move it into environment, sustainability and housing in 2007, this was a strong legacy whereby ESDGC was to be inspected through regulation. Now, this was not in legislation. There was no requirement that would last in perpetuity through regulation, but through legislation, but in regulation there were requirements. But of course, regulation requirements can be changed, and new ministers have new ideas. And interestingly enough, that in 2008, although the minister had a strong interest in embedding sustainable development, for the first time you see Welsh Government updates where it actually says no action required. So what was being on a journey to regulation from 2000 to 2007 then became a set of advice and guidance updates. And that's important in terms of what happens next. I think one of the most powerful mechanisms for people to see about their own impact on people's lives is this slide on the ecological footprint. There are many ways you can measure your ecological footprint. There are at least 3 or 4 that you can find on the internet very quickly. But I've chosen in this context to use the best foot forward or the footprint that WWF offer. And it's a really interesting exercise to work with young people or adults to see their own impact on both their own impact because of their own choices or their parental choices, and potentially what they can do to change those choices and how that changes the impact. And I think that's a really important agenda, is to make people feel that they can be part of a solution. There's no point in identifying to somebody that actually their 6 journeys on an aeroplane a year is bad for the planet if we don't also help engage with them in terms of the kind of choices they might make that might improve their impact on the planet by reducing their carbon emissions. And there are 4 elements that make up the ecological footprint which are not equal. So housing, including energy, is about 1/4 of our footprints. Food is about 1/5 of our footprint. Transport, nearly 1/5. But stuff, how consumerist we are as a family, as a society, that is nearly 40% of our footprint. So if we're really going to affect how we live, we have to think about how much stuff we have. Do we really need to upgrade our computers, our mobile phones, our clothes on very regular bases? Or should we be back to an agenda of make, do and mend? How long can we keep something alive? And I'm delighted that actually now my old Nokia phone, which is still sitting in my kitchen drawer, is now acquiring a value that is probably greater than my current iPhone, because people are starting to recognise that very well-made products that last have an additional value. And I think that that's a very, very important value in the context of sustainable development. So I would encourage anybody in this room who hasn't yet measured their own ecological footprint to not only measure it, but actually think about what kind of actions you can take to reduce it. And here's a slide where I'm looking at what I do in my home life, because I believe that if we have an individual responsibility and we have a collective responsibility, then we can't separate this. You can't go to work and behave in a high carbon way if you believe that it's really important that you bring down your own footprint. You know, if we want to do things individually to make an impact, then it becomes far better if we can demonstrate in our own lives that we're endorsing this agenda. And I can honestly tell you that as somebody who's been a minister, where there's a freedom of information request about your behaviour on a daily basis, particularly if you're the environment minister, it was of enormous delight to me that the press in Wales never found anything to express concern about, except that I was charging effectively the Welsh Government more money because I insisted on going by train rather than plane in terms of international visits. Although obviously, like other people in this room, sometimes I could not do that because in order to participate in the major COP conferences on climate change, sometimes that did involve planes. But I thought just a glimpse of my good life to show you that hopefully I have some credentials that I do live my own dream, not least in the amount of cider it's possible for our very small orchard to make. But we do run the house off wood. We do subscribe to a green energy ethical company. I drive an electric car. We do grow as much of our own food as possible. We trade that wherever we can. We keep bees. We try and grow flowers for bees as well. And I think on that picture, one of the nicest elements of the pictures there is actually the mushrooms we can gather from our local fields. But please don't do that unless you've got some clear advice about which ones it's possible to eat. But all of this for me was part of how we could build a new agenda in Wales. What Wales would look like if within the lifetime of a generation Wales would use only its fair share of resources. Now, a lifetime of a generation we can think of in terms of 20, 25 years, but what we were aiming to get to is by the time we got to 2050, where all the climate change targets were going, in One Wales, One Planet, the document that tried to lay out the vision strategy for what a more sustainable Wales would look like in 2009, and you can still access that today. And the immense and tremendous number of people who contributed to that, I'm so grateful for. But if you think about what a nation would look like if it was going to be fairer in use of resources, it has to actively plan for that. And if you have a vision, you need to have the mechanisms for delivery. And one of the ways in which I look to deliver during my time as Minister was through legislation. And I'm delighted that one area which I did legislate for as Minister, or two areas, one about the charge on carrier bags was then taken out across the UK, and so many of you in England will be experiencing the outcome of the decisions that we took in Wales back in 2009. But probably more importantly, we put legislation in place in terms of recycling that means that as of last week, Wales is now the third or fourth best recycling country in the world. And that's legislative, regulatory targets where the local authorities are squeezed each year to reduce landfill more and to recycle more. And it's that kind of reduction agenda, that kind of deliberate delivery of a vision that is needed if we are going to have an opportunity to be more sustainable in what we do. And I think that leads me on nicely to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. You will have spotted that there is a 6-year gap between the 2009 vision of One Wales, One Planet and the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. But there are a couple of elements that really contribute towards this story that happened between 2009 and 2011. The first one was that despite the vision that we'd put out in One Wales, One Planet, because there was no legislative backup, because there was no regulatory framework, it meant that the vision was delivered by some ministers with a real passion, and but not as much by others. And when the Wales Audit Office looked at how effective this agenda was being delivered across the whole of Welsh Assembly Government, as it was called at the time, they found it wasn't. It was not influencing the business of the organisation on a daily basis. And an independent researcher commissioned by WWF, who looked at whether the policies were delivering against this agenda, found that broadly not, and I didn't escape criticism myself either in the context of that. And then, of course, when the first Conservative Liberal coalition government came in, one of their first actions, and I still believe, because this is absolutely not a party political point, I still believe it was accidental rather than by design, was the loss of the independent, expert Sustainable Development Commission. I mean, for 6 or 7 years, Prior to that, we had all benefited in the context of government from the superb, independent, qualitative and quantitative expert advice that came through the independent commissioners. And I was delighted to be invited to speak at their 10-year anniversary conference in 2010. And of course, it was just after that that the commission was disbanded. And I remember reflecting on the way back from Bristol to Cardiff on the train that if this agenda is important enough for it to be at the centre of Welsh thinking, if we're going to deliver on that ambition that was originally outlined in the Government of Wales Act to promote sustainable development in everything the country did, then it's going to need legislation. So on the back of an envelope, effectively, on that train journey, I crafted 4 key components of what is now become the Wellbeing Future Generations Act. That all the public sector in Wales, which is responsible to Welsh Government, would need to put sustainable development at the heart of what they do. That there must be an independent commissioner with substantial powers to audit that in the same way as public bodies are usually audited. That the audit function should largely be carried out by the Audit Office, because that was the body that normally audited in terms of public sector. So there wasn't an additional and potentially competitive auditing and monitoring regime. And that this actually was an agenda which needed to ensure that for all those public bodies which were caught by the legislation, that over a period of time they could demonstrate unequivocally that they were moving towards sustainable development and the original vision and strategy which had been so well supported in the One Wales, One Planet document in 2009. And we now have that. I left government in 2011 and moved into the higher education sector, but I wrote this into the manifesto. And I'm absolutely delighted that Wales is now the first country in the world in the context of looking both at how it's delivering in its public sector, but also how it's going to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, that has put a piece of legislation in place that is countrywide, that is able to deliver on both objectives, and where the UN has said what Wales is doing today, the world will need to do tomorrow. So very quickly, in the context of the Act is called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It was passed in 2015, but it came into force only in April last year. So as we speak today, it's still not been in force for a whole year. All organisations in Wales which are subject to the Act, which is all the public sector in Wales, which is in the devolved control of Welsh Government, has to deliver against the 7 goals outlined on this slide. They are overseen by the Future Generations Commissioner with substantial powers that I've already mentioned. And very importantly, they're delivering on improving the environmental, social, economic and cultural well-being of the people of Wales. I really want to pay tribute to all those Assembly members who spent the year taking this legislation through the Assembly in order to create the Act. Because adding that notion of cultural, of identity, of values of a nation into the more traditional environmental, social and economic 3-legged approach to sustainable development, I think means in the context of Wales, we have an Eisteddfod chair piece of legislation rather than a 3-legged stool. And I think if you look at the descriptors that are up on the slide now, these goals are not just goals you can play with. You can't define a prosperous Wales in the context of a high carbon society because that suits you. You can't define prosperity in terms of short-termism because that suits you. Because as you'll see in terms of this particular slide, a prosperous Wales is an innovative, productive and low carbon society which recognises the limits of the global environment and uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change, and which develops a skilled and well-educated population in an economy which generates wealth and provides employment opportunities, allowing people to take advantage of the wealth generated through securing decent work. Now, that's not just a description. That description and all those other descriptions of the 7 goals are in the Act. This is a legislative description. So everybody now who defines a prosperous Wales has to use that definition of what a prosperous Wales looked like. This is really transformative for the future and a very exciting way of taking this agenda forward. So the Act has the 7 goals, those descriptors. It has that principle at the heart of improving the well-being, the economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being of the people in Wales. And it relates to a definition of sustainable development, that Brundtland definition we looked at the beginning, that the Welsh Government has used all the way through. But the Act demands more of people. It demands that they look to 5 ways of working as well, and these are also in the Act. It demands that people are looking to the longer term, that the actions they take are preventative, that they will integrate the goals with each other, that they will collaborate with new partners and existing partners in terms of reaching well-being objectives, and they will involve stakeholders in doing that. So there is a potential transformation here where public services in Wales will be delivered for the long term. They will have stakeholder engagement, there'll be wider collaboration through partners, they will integrate a number of goals in the context of their delivery, and they will be deliberately preventative in terms of worsening situations. I think this is inspirational. I can say these things are inspirational because they are nothing to do with me. I laid out those 4 points in the context of what the Act needed to do, and it is the Assembly members of the last administration and the current administration who have put this Act together and are implementing the delivery of the legislation. It will take time. All public bodies now are having to publish wellbeing assessments by the 22nd of March. So those wellbeing assessments, unless any are late, are going to be out there for all the public authority areas in Wales based on local government boundaries now. Then every single one of those individual authorities and also the new public services boards, a collaborative activity based on local government boundaries, has to produce a wellbeing plan. And it's those wellbeing plans that will deliver on the permission to think differently. So I think that tying this to the UNESCO Decade of Education for Sustainable Development's final report of 2014, as you'll see on the slide, we know that education for sustainable development has galvanised pedagogical innovation. And there are huge examples of that in Wales, and I'll put up a list in the moment of where people can access resources. We know that education for sustainable development encourages extensive partnerships and networks. And now here in Wales as a country, not only do we have those networks that have come together voluntarily, but there are new statutory networks charged with the responsibility to deliver on this new Act. But I think that the comment in the report that perhaps one of the most significant lessons learned during the decade is that strong political leadership is instrumental to advancing ESD is a lesson that has to be taken as probably the primary lesson. So I think what's been really interesting is that although ESD in Wales took a bit of a dip between 2008 and 2015 with the coming into force of the Act, what is now happening is a new generation of opportunity. So only this year, in January, the Welsh Government, a first update for many, many years on the Welsh Government site, says that ESD-GC, we maintained the GC in Wales, which I'm really delighted to see, is being mainstreamed across all education sectors, And to ensure that it's effectively embedded, it is part of the inspection framework introduced by ESTIN, which is our inspection body, in September 2010. So the opportunities to build on that regulatory framework because of a new piece of legislation are now there. And here you'll see a list of curriculum materials that if you access the hyperlink to the Welsh Government website, any of those materials are available to you. But just to show you, for example, the different kinds of approaches in Wales, you'll just see on this slide, on the one hand, you've got guidance for teachers and those who would be teachers. On the other hand, you've got guides for work-based learners. So that commitment to work right across the piece in all learning settings has been maintained. And I think what's also interesting is that this whole approach is now starting to create an enormous amount of interest in authors looking to take this approach and put the policy in place in terms of different settings. This is not about public services delivering. In the context of this book, The One Planet Life, which I was privileged to write the foreword to, this is about building low-impact dwellings. This is about whether or not this kind of legislation could see the Freiburg of the future in Wales, where there's an absolute focus on low-emission delivery. And Lammas, the first planned eco-village in the UK, is described, pictures on the front cover here, where they are experimenting with not only very low-impact dwellings, but very low-cost dwellings, and linking their activity back to the countryside, getting a beneficial opportunity to buy land at agricultural values rather than development values in return for now growing crops and getting half their livelihood from that. So I think that the legislation might well throw out all sorts of new opportunities for the future. I've not put a slide up about our new curriculum in Wales. Our Scottish friends will know that Professor Graham Donaldson from Glasgow University has been instrumental in redefining our curriculum for us. But what I can say is when I was Education Minister back in the year 2000 and we started developing our foundation phase for our 3 to 7-year-olds and focusing on areas of learning including outdoor learning and education for sustainable development and global citizenship, Graham's curriculum review now wants to take that right throughout the whole of the education system. So I think that the stage is now there with the legislation, with curriculum support in the new curriculum, with the all-age approach for Wales once again to lift its head up and demonstrate in practice education for sustainable development and global citizenship. And the slide here, which is a direct screenshot from the ESD report on sustainable development, shows that in 2014, only 29% of countries in the world had any legislative protection for sustainable development. I hope that other countries will be interested in monitoring what happens in Wales as we look at the fact that if the UN are saying what Wales is doing today, the world will do tomorrow. I want to combine that with John Rawls, philosopher, American philosopher, who says, do unto future generations what you would have past generations do unto you. I don't think there's any better way of living our lives and developing government agendas and education agendas than living up to that spirit. Thank you.